Well, the no vote has been accused of making stuff up when they warned earlier about the water and land reclamation that you've just discussed. But this seminar that you're discussing now is called Cultural Water for Cultural Economies, Pathways to Water Justice. And it does talk about the acquisition of land rights toward Indigenous peoples and taking it away from everybody else who is Australian. Now, this is something that we've seen in another country, that would be New Zealand. Has it worked out well for the New Zealanders? Is everybody happier now that, water has become racist?
Yes, so in New Zealand is leading the way in this area, but it's nothing to be proud of. In 2017, they introduced a law and it granted the Wanganui River personhood status. And they also have this asset confiscation program. It's known as Three Waters, and it handed over the governance of the water assets of 67 councils to an equal number of tribal members and council representatives. So this is what's happening in New Zealand, and this is actually what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wants. And we know this because he said so on social media in 2020. But really what we're seeing here is what's happening in New Zealand is coming to Australia, but it's via the universities.
Well, the idea of colonial water theft is quite odd to start with. If you actually think about it for more than 5 seconds, I mean, despite there being no ability to steal water because it's a water cycle, it gets used and comes back down again. The settlers wandered into abandoned patches of bush and built their little shacks. They were hardly engaging in some kind of industrial water theft. What does water justice look like? Because you never hear about anyone complaining about water theft when it comes to using town water coming out of dams that were built. You only ever seem to hear about it in terms of ordinary people having access to the natural resources, like going down the river for a fish or taking out their boat. Is this what water justice is going to specifically target, ordinary Australians?
Well, I think it's related to the voice. Really is just the beginning of what they want to do. We know that the next logical step, if the voice passes, we're going to see treaties, reparations, truth-tellings, and water justice is just a part of that. It's a part of this divisive racial politics that we're seeing in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, with the Waitangi Tribunal, it resulted with, during the pandemic, critical health resources were allocated on the basis of race and not need. And it also led to race-based policing, which resulted in an approach that was soft on crime. So water justice is very much connected to activism, and this activism that has become very institutionalised in the universities, in government, and also in business, in the private sector.
Well, you write, and I quote, "By demanding preferential access to critical government resources for Maori, the Waitangi Tribunal has demonstrated just how quickly an advisory body can be hijacked by social justice activists." Now, when you talk about the vibe in your article, is it a social justice vibe that we're getting caught up here with The Voice?
Yes, it is a social justice vibe, but the interesting thing is it's not just a social issue now, it's a legal issue. And with the Waitangi Tribunal, it started out, as a social justice thing, as a purely advisory body. But through a series of court interpretations, including the 1987 lands case, it became a quasi-judicial body with de facto power to impose outcomes on the New Zealand government and redress past Maori grievances. So this social activism is making its way into legal institutions, academic institutions. It's really everywhere now.
Well, just one final question, Brianna. The Institute of Public Affairs has its finger on the pulse of Australia. You do a lot of research into how Australians are thinking and feeling. Have you noticed during your work there that there's been a shift in Australian thinking when it comes to the voice to Parliament? Because what I've seen, especially in relation to comments on the articles that we post in the Spectator, is that people are starting to move away from the voice to Parliament the more they learn from it, and also the more they hear things like, let's have a race tax as far as pay the rent goes. I'm not seeing, it's not going in a forward direction as far as I can tell. Would you agree?
Well, what we've seen is when the voice was first put out before the public eye, the first polls were coming in at 64%. So support for the voice was at 64%. Now, in the latest polls, which were released in early June, it was down to 46%. So those in favour of the voice were under 50%, And I think this shows that Australians are concerned about divisive racial politics. They are concerned about changing the constitution and what this will mean for our nation.